What if the woman who turned England into a global empire was never a woman at all? The theory has a name: the Bisley Boy. And once you hear the details, you will not be able to unsee them. A dead princess, a peasant boy pulled from the mud, and 44 years of the most audacious deception in royal history, carried out right under the nose of every king, diplomat, and court in Europe. This is not folklore. The pieces fit. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly how it was done. To understand why someone would pull off a deception of this scale, you first need to understand what was at stake. England in the mid-1500s was not a stable kingdom. It was a powder keg. The Tudor dynasty, the royal house that Henry VIII had built through blood, war, and sheer brutality, was hanging by a thread. And that thread had a name: Elizabeth. She was the last viable heir. If she died without producing a successor, the throne would collapse into a vacuum. And in 16th century Europe, a power vacuum did not stay empty for long. Catholic Spain was watching. French factions were circling. Internal noble houses were already sharpening their knives, waiting for the right moment to make their move. A dead princess meant civil war. It meant foreign invasion. It meant the complete unraveling of everything the Tudors had bled to build. So when Elizabeth's tutors and guardians found themselves facing the unthinkable, her sudden death away from court with no official record and no royal witness, they were not just facing a personal tragedy. They were staring down the collapse of a nation. The substitution was not madness. It was cold, calculated survival. Find someone who could pass, buy time, protect the crown at all costs. In that moment, the crime and the duty became the same thing. And that is what makes this theory so difficult to simply dismiss. Because the people who allegedly carried it out had every reason in the world to do exactly that. But knowing why the deception happened is only half the story. The real question is, how did it start? And for that, we go back to a quiet English village in 1543, where everything changed in a single afternoon. Bisley, a small, unremarkable village in Gloucestershire, the kind of place history never pays attention to. But in 1543, history made an exception. The young Elizabeth had been sent there to stay while a sweating sickness tore through London. It was meant to be a precaution, a safe retreat. Instead, it became the scene of the most dangerous secret in English history. She died. Suddenly, violently ill and gone before anyone could send word to the court. And standing over her body was Roger Ascham, her tutor, one of the few people responsible for her safety. Facing a problem with no clean solution, Henry VIII was on his way to visit his daughter. Not in weeks, in days. Henry VIII was not a man you disappointed. He was not a man you gave bad news to without consequence. He had executed wives. He had broken with the entire Catholic Church over a personal dispute. The idea of arriving at his doorstep and telling him his daughter was dead, without warning, without a body to present, without a story that made sense, was not just career-ending. It was potentially life-ending. So Ascham and the small circle around him made a decision that defied every law, every boundary, every rational limit of what a human being should attempt. They found a boy, a local child from the village, red-haired, pale-skinned, slight in build, close enough in age, close enough in features. And in an era before photography, before forensic records, before any form of identity verification beyond the human eye, close enough was enough. The preparation must have been frantic. The clothes, the posture, the silence. And that last detail turned out to be the most important one of all, because the real Elizabeth had been famously timid around her father. Quiet, withdrawn. She rarely spoke in his presence, rarely held his gaze. The terror Henry inspired in his own daughter became, by pure accident, the perfect cover for an imposter who had no idea what to say. When Henry arrived, the boy stood still, kept his eyes low, and said nothing. And Henry VIII, the most feared man in Europe, a king who prided himself on his intelligence and dominance, saw exactly what he expected to see. His daughter, alive, respectful, and silent. The trick worked. On the first try, against the worst possible audience. And once it worked once, the path forward was set. There was no going back. The boy was Elizabeth now. And the machinery of the deception had to run. Not for days, not for months, but for the rest of a reign that would last 44 years. Henry VIII never suspected a thing, but Henry would eventually die. And what came next was far more dangerous. A public reign, a royal court full of sharp eyes, and decades of appearances that demanded more than just silence and a bowed head. The imposter needed a system, and somehow incredibly he built one. The reign of Elizabeth I was one of the most visible in English history. Public appearances, foreign ambassadors, portraits commissioned across the continent. Every move watched, analyzed, and recorded. And yet, for over 4 decades, not a single person in that court produced credible, documented proof of what the theory claims was hiding in plain sight. That did not happen by accident. The face came first. Elizabethan court makeup was already extreme by modern standards. Thick, white, heavily applied. But the theory suggests the imposter took it further. Layers of toxic mineral compounds, corrosive white paste made from vinegar and heavy metal pigments, applied not for fashion but for function. To flatten skin texture, to seal the jawline, to bury any trace of facial hair beneath a mask that the entire court simply accepted as vanity. The wigs served the same double purpose. Tudor fashion normalized elaborate hairpieces for women of status. But as the reign progressed and the imposter aged, the wigs became less of a style choice and more of a necessity, concealing the natural hair loss that comes with a male body growing old. Then there was the inner circle. Kat Ashley, Elizabeth's lifelong confidant and keeper of her chambers, is the central figure here. Access to the Queen's private rooms was not a privilege. It was a controlled operation. Dressing and undressing happened behind closed doors with a fixed group of trusted attendants. Physicians were kept at a deliberate distance. Medical examinations by the standards of the time required permission, and that permission was never freely given. But the most devastating move, the one that closed every remaining gap, was the Virgin Queen strategy. By publicly declaring she would never marry, the imposter eliminated the 2 greatest threats to the secret in a single stroke. The premarital physical examination that noble marriages required, and the impossibility of producing an heir. It was framed as devotion to England, as sacrifice, as strength. It was, if the theory holds, the most brilliant act of self-preservation in recorded royal history. And it held. For 44 years it held, until the earth itself decided to speak. For centuries, the Bisley Boy remained exactly what most people assumed it was. A local legend. A village story. The kind of tale that gets passed down through generations and slowly loses its credibility simply by existing too long without evidence. Then came 1800, and the ground cracked open. During renovation work in the village of Bisley, workers uncovered a stone coffin buried beneath the church grounds. Inside it were the skeletal remains of a young girl dressed in clothing consistent with the Tudor period. No name, no inscription, no official record of a burial at that location. Just a child hidden underground, in clothes that placed her squarely in the 16th century. For those who already knew the local legend, the implication was immediate. This was not a coincidence of location. Bisley was not a major site. There was no reason for an unrecorded Tudor-era child burial to exist there. Unless someone had needed to hide something in a hurry, without ceremony, without documentation, and without ever intending it to be found. The stone coffin itself added weight to that reading. Common children were not buried in stone. Stone coffins were reserved for individuals of significance, people whose death carried weight, whose remains needed to be preserved, or whose burial needed to be concealed with a permanence that a simple grave in the soil could not guarantee. Whoever placed that girl in that coffin knew exactly what they were doing. They were not just burying a body, they were burying a secret. And the Tudor-era garments found with the remains were not the clothes of a peasant child. They were finer than that, detailed enough to suggest someone of standing, or at the very least, someone who had been dressed with intention before being sealed away. When you place all of that together, the location, the concealment, the quality of the clothing, the complete absence of any official record, what you are left with is not folklore. Truth or myth, the Bisley Boy refuses to disappear. And that alone says something. Official history gives us a queen who never married, never allowed a physician close, never let anyone truly behind the curtain. A ruler who built an empire while keeping the world at arm's length for 44 years? Every explanation history offers for those choices is reasonable. But the theory fills the same gaps with a logic that is equally difficult to argue against. What was buried in that stone coffin in Bisley? Why were physicians kept away from the most powerful woman in England? Why did the Virgin Queen strategy hold without a single crack for nearly half a century? The records do not answer those questions. They never have. And maybe that is the point. If this story made you see Elizabeth I differently, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Subscribe. Because every week we pull apart the stories that official history decided to leave buried. Drop a comment below with what you think. Real deception or the greatest legend England ever produced? And if you found this worth your time, leave a like. It tells us to keep going deeper. We will see you in the next one.